So we return to the world of Shin Megami Tensei. As with the first game, the SMT franchise is a classic JRPG series from the developers Atlas that has established a reputation on unique settings, challenging gameplay, and style emulated by no other. With many spin-offs within an unofficially established multiverse, the series has been littered with many standalone stories and many different takes on the gameplay and lore. This allows a sense of flexibility while also holding the series' defining norms in place. Last time, we looked at Digital Devil Saga, which is also known as Digital Devil Saga Avatar Tuner. It was released as the first part of a duology before its follow-up, Digital Devil Saga 2, was released about a half year later in 2005. Since then, both parts have found PS3 release as PS2 classics on the PlayStation Network. The duology was Atlas's large attempt to translate the series' classic aesthetics, gameplay systems, and identity into a full-fledged cinematic and story-driven experience. Especially true at the time, the story focus was not an established quality of any SMT property. It also may have proved to be their most extensive look at cinematic storytelling itself. The first game proved that there was some merit to the approach, but between some balancing concerns and the fact that it was intentionally left unfinished for the sake of the story in multiple parts, the second game has a lot to prove. And of course, expect many spoilers from the first game here, because it's very difficult to talk about this one as a follow-up without that. For now, get hungry again, everyone. The second course is ready. Much like the first game, Digital Devil Saga 2 stands on the shoulders of giants. SMT series games, between the spin-offs, main series, and more, tends to build off one of a few gameplay systems stemming from the same general premises. There is dungeon crawling, and there is random turn-based battles held within those dungeons. With a greater focus of story in Digital Devil Saga itself, the dungeons have a greater sense of context than the desert, jungle, snow, or other simple theming that some developers tend to fall into using very easily for games. Growing from the first game, the turn press system is once again expanded upon from the system developed in that first game. With teams up to 3 in turn-based combat, each side is allotted turns to pass to others, extend by exploiting weaknesses, or lose striking enemy strengths. With both sides abiding by the same rules, the strategy options are plentiful. When you come to the major changes from the first game, you really have to address the progression tactics, progression systems, and a greater look into the balancing of strategy throughout the adventure. In terms of tactics, the game really tries to offer some relief on grinding to the party and a greater focus on strategic grinding. As you can still stand by healing stations, running around to activate random battles to grind, but the previous mechanics to help you focus those efforts are refined and expanded upon. Most notable is the Berserk forms. Previously, the encounter rate was dependent on the solar cycles you see in the top corner of the screen. Now, instead of just an increased encounter rate, you have a chance to enter Berserk mode. These half-transformed versions of the characters are inaccurate cannons, with limitations on the moves they can use, but the experience increase from winning is huge. You also have less battle-based changes. You can find valuable plants across the dungeons. Selling them is a huge boon to your funds and highly encourages people to look through dungeons more thoroughly. For progression systems, I have to mostly talk about the mantra changes. In the first game, the mantras were very strictly kept to progression trees you can move from left to right on. In the second outing, it's a grid. The biggest upside of the first game system was the ability to focus really heavily on certain types of skills and playstyles. This new system trades some of that away for some increases in the flexibility of the system. Overall, I'd say it's an overall net positive. Lastly, we really need to talk about the balancing in the game. Mostly, the upgrades to the battle system were tweaks to the established system, and the change of the balancing is one of the most notable and most hidden changes to that. In the first game, the battles had a tendency to be easily broken. The bosses relied too heavily on gimmicks, and often the easiest path forward was finding the optimal moveset to completely negate their gimmicks. In a sense, that made the game too easy at times, and by too easy, I don't mean that I want difficult games. In fact, I'm not really even the type to seek out those experiences in the first place. Essentially, how you overcome challenges tends to not really feel like overcoming them. That sense of satisfaction was dulled considerably, though still there to an extent. In this second outing, the developers really felt like they were well aware of this issue. How effective were their changes, though? Well, it's a bit of a mixed bag. The changes of creating such a liberating gameplay system means that finding a balance between the impossible and the easily broken is quite difficult, and I will acknowledge that. Small variances can have dramatic effects, basically. Some battles are very reminiscent of the first game's problems. Some battles seem like your strategy itself has very little bearing on actually winning when it comes down to it. Some battles hit that sweet spot between the two, but it's unclear if that, by the end, they really worked out a formula to designing the battles to hit that sweet spot, or if they just ended up randomly hitting it on whatever they tried to do. That if they could take that extra step, they might have been able to get that sweet spot consistently. In general, though, it would be considered a good progression from the more consistent issues of the first title, but it's just not quite there yet. Overall, the gameplay is really just more of the same from the first game. The battles are still strategically liberating and fun. The dungeon crawling is still just as fun as any dungeon crawling is going to be. The systems have upgrades and tweaks, and the balancing issues from the first game are handled better despite not really having a complete fix. If you like the first game, then you'll like this one. Digital Devil Saga 1 had ended on a cliffhanger. Digital Devil Saga 2 takes up the plot at that point, as each member of the Embryon find themselves waking up in a new world unfamiliar to them. To their dismay, this Nirvana is a world debatably worse off than the junkyard itself. Many years before, a change to the sunlight caused those to actually turn into stone. The only countermeasures were to cut yourself off from direct sunlight or to take in a virus that offers immunity. The side effect of this virus? Well, we've seen it before. They become demons. The remaining population finds himself in a struggle against one another. One side is Karma Society that has developed a city cloaked in glass and embraces the demon virus. Everyone else is forced to resist, held up in the underground of the old world. It's a one-sided struggle, the latter considered closer to prey for the demons in the Karma Society. If the first game's junkyard was the embodiment of pursuing one final hope through the light at the end of the tunnel, then the Nirvana of the second game is the embodiment of that hope dying in one final twist of the knife. The factions are self-destructive to a fault, and focus so heavily on embracing extremist ideologies that it'll take a miracle to bring them back from the brink. And really, that's sort of the point. In comparison to the more fantasy book-esque setup of the first game, this one is quick to throw reality in your face. It wants you to go beyond your cyclical, self-destructive delusions and really delves deep into that thematic point. In a sense, the quick turnaround to embracing this may be a notch abrupt, but it's understandable since this was, well, originally planned to be a trilogy. The story really travels to all sorts of starting and end points with a lot of the nature of the world being explored, truths being revealed, and the cast on board for a crazy rollercoaster ride. Some of these truths are ridiculous silly even, and others make perfect sense. Where the original story really felt like mostly set up only to leave off with more questions than answers, Digital Devil Saga 2 capitalizes by delving into the payoff to that setup early and consistently. To an extent, this includes the characters. One of my most notable complaints about the first game is that the cast didn't really get much development. In a sense, the second game extends this problem, in another sense it closes off loose ends as well. There are, of course, some new characters included, like the Resistance leader Roland, the young boy Fred, and the leadership of the Karma Society. But mainly the focus is on the old cast. Everyone gets their pie and backstory as the depth plan for them is revealed to satisfying little chunks. But outside of some good exceptions like Gale, Heat, and to some extent Roland even, this depth feels more like backstory than development. Most of the characters don't really develop as people. They have their place in the world, and how the puzzle comes together is a fascinating sight to behold, but they often feel like puzzle pieces in the grand scheme of things. High quality puzzle pieces, yes, but puzzle pieces tend to not like changing shape. Even the exceptions have something lacking to them. Gale's development was mostly done in the first game, and his role in this is more like the excellent payoff to the job well done for that you don't get to see in the first game. Heat's developed more in the background, as his most important moments are mostly off-screen, and Roland's arc is resolved over the course of maybe a third of the game. I will admit that this might just be a mismatch of expectations. The plot tries its hardest to be a personal story while also tackling concepts on a much grander scale than each individual could ever hope to touch. But it does excellently at devising an emotional, satisfying end to the story. So the characters tend to feel like they end up becoming complementary to that goal, instead of having fully fleshed out stories of their own. Ultimately, what amounts to it is that the story is not perfect. It does what it tries to do very well, but sacrifices other aspects to achieve it. What it achieves is a very SMT plot, It also has some issues with pacing, with the story feeling more and more jam-packed into isolated sections with longer and longer dungeons as you go. The story is still quite good by playing off the setup from the first game and creating essentially a big game of payoffs to those mysteries. While the first game had issues with never showing its card, the second game is like throwing down a full house. Presentation-wise, Digital Devil Saga 2 is an extension of the first game's style and decisions. While the lighting certainly has more orange tones to it than green this time around, the art style is still classic Kaneko and continues to feel like a warped darkness coming through the world and characters. New designs are pretty on point, and the setting creates more contemporary and decrepit themes to work with. There are certainly some odd choices, but the shift to a more grounded world visually is handled without making the previous designs feel any more out of place than intended. These all contribute to the world tone and atmosphere that lies as a cornerstone to the storytelling, and plays much more heavily on the contrast between destruction and sterility. Musically, there isn't much difference from the first game. Shoji Meguro does take the helm again, and it's hard to say there's much else to say about it that I didn't say about the first game. Battle music tends to stand out with its guitar-driven tension, and there's a lot to love about them. There's also quite a few story moment piano pieces that really help those scenes drive their message home, but at the same time those can fall into obscurity when the pacing problems of the games are considered. Dungeons do try their hardest to use a more synthesized instrumentation to create the atmosphere, and they do this relatively well. Musically though, it's a lot like the first game soundtrack. Unmemorable for the dungeon ones. Overall, the tone is well harmonized and builds on the first game by introducing new elements to the setting. The art style is the main driving force making the setting work, and if you like the first game, this is more of the same. Cutscenes are certainly no exception. In fact, the cinematography and general quality of the cutscenes certainly took a step up for me. For the increased amount of emotional important scenes in this final part of the story, it served it quite well. There is a problem with the pacing of the scenes, but that's more structural than anything. In terms of the port quality, the first game had some issues with sound shifting and some slowdown. I can't confirm the slight slowdown of the game still persists, but the sound shift appears to be non-existent. As the sound shift seemed to be inherently connected to the slowdown previously, I'd wager that the slowdown is also no longer present. No notable glitches to report. Digital Devil Saga 2 is definitely an extension of the first game's systems and design decisions across battle plot and presentation. The liberating strategic combat returns with new twists to improve the flexibility in acquiring those tactical options. The atmosphere remains much the same, with less mystery and more climactic drama on display as the mysteries resolve themselves. As said in the gameplay section, one of the biggest problems with the first game was the sense of balance between the strategic options. At times, a boss could rely on gimmicks heavily enough that a simple moveset could overwhelm it and break boss battles. In the second game, though, it seems very clear that Atlus tried to address this with mixed results. While the frustration iconic to the franchise seems apparent, the balancing is sort of all over the place. Sometimes it's just so unpredictable that strategy seems like it means very little. Sometimes it falls back to the broken, clearly superior movesets that broke the first game. A good amount of the time, though, it does manage to hit that sweet spot. Story-wise, the plot is a big improvement over the first game. While the first game does have a larger mystery factor to it, the second outing relies more on emotional moments where the forces that be struggle against one another. Ultimately, it leads up to quite a climactic and satisfying end. There's still some things that are questionable and unknown, but realistically, it's really not something I can say about the first game, and it really does improve upon that by giving you a sense of satisfaction by the end. For the plot, the biggest problem is definitely the pacing I discussed. Considering it, this actually might be because there's a lot more compelling moments than the first game, but the dungeon's increasing length as the game progresses really starts to show. Hours can be spent in the dungeon, only to end it with a set of excellent story moments that really could have been sprinkled more across the dungeon itself. It also really seems counterintuitive to succeed on a good plot only to squander the impact of bad storytelling. While this isn't to say it destroys the enjoyment of it, it definitely pulls it down a few more levels than it could have been. Digital Devil Saga 2 is quite the finale to this excellent duology. Much like its predecessor, it follows the line of unique experiences by expanding on it, creating conclusive elements in plots and mechanics. While the answers are all on the table, it does feel as though it becomes a notch too SMT by the end, and a little less its own beast. This is especially true in how it treats its characters to fulfill plot threads that the creators wanted. In the end, though, it takes very little away from the overall quality. The greatest issues stand more heavily in the narrative pacing and some balancing that was never quite fixed from the first game. The second outing is really still quite fun and liberatingly strategic, with answers galore to the mystery plot setup from the first game. While the first game's feeling of incompleteness really stopped it from stepping up to higher heights, and while this game does have its own host of problems itself, I would definitely say that it improves enough on the previous entry to stand atop with the others at the top of the genre. The duology is certainly a memorable one, and this outing has simply been good enough that I could really imagine Atlus improving should they ever return to it in the future. Okay, recommendations. I probably said this one for the first game, but SMT Nocturne, same base. These are probably the same from the first game. SMT Nocturne, same basic gameplay system. I don't know if it's cinematic, I haven't played it myself, but I know that this is where that this type of gameplay system was originally introduced. You also have the Persona series, which is not cinematic storytelling, but it does have a greater focus on storytelling within the SMT actual catalog. So, if you like this, then you'll probably just want to go play other Atlus games, I think, because it is very unique. It is something that you don't see much from the genre or the industry in general, and Atlus tends to be the biggest provider of these sorts of experiences. So if you like this, go check out their other games. Other than that, I'm sorry this went up late. The stuff for Trails of Cold Steel, the extra stuff I was experimenting with after that series ended, took a lot more of my time than I was expecting, so this might be up, I think, probably end up being up about like a week later than I expected, and then I'll be right on the Trails of Cold Steel review right after this, because I ended this series at the same time as that, so I need to do reviews for both of them. I'm gonna have another series ending by the time I get the Trails of Cold Steel 2 review up, and it's going to be so fun. I'm gonna be busy for a while, so see you all next time. Drive safely, everyone.